He turned burning homes into a real estate empire, funded a dictator's rise, and became the richest man Rome had ever seen. Then he marched an army into the desert chasing one more fortune, and the desert swallowed him whole. This is the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the man who bought Rome. And the wildest part, they still use his name today as a synonym for wealth. Rome, 115 BC, patrician family, respectable but not extraordinary, in a city about to eat itself alive. Young Marcus grew up in a household that had already tasted political violence up close. His own father, a former consul, would later choose suicide over capture during the civil wars rather than fall into enemy hands. That was a lesson Marcus absorbed early. In Rome, power wasn't inherited, it was seized, defended, and if necessary, bought. Civil war broke out between Marius and Sulla, and young Crassus, still in his 20s, picked the winning side, fighting for Sulla and helping secure a decisive victory at the very gates of Rome. When Sulla took the city, the proscriptions began. Lists of enemies of the state nailed up in the forum, their property seized, their throats cut, sometimes by neighbors eager for the reward money. Most Romans hid indoors and prayed their names weren't next. Crassus, he bought a shopping list. Next name, please. He'd tell his clerk. This one owned 3 insulae near the forum. Burn the deeds. Buy the deeds, whichever is cheaper today. Sir, the clerk once warned him, the family hasn't even been arrested yet. Then we are early, Crassus replied. Get me the notary before the soldiers get here. There are even accounts of a wealthy man in Brutium, a man who wasn't even on the original list, somehow getting added to it, and his estate landing in Crassus's hands almost immediately after. Nobody investigated, nobody dared to. While the city buried its dead, Crassus bought up their houses for pennies, confiscated land, condemned estates, entire fortunes changing hands for a fraction of their worth, and Crassus was always first in line with cash in hand. By the time the killing finally stopped, he had assembled a real estate portfolio most kings would envy, and a reputation forming right alongside it. Even Sulla, a man not exactly known for his moral clarity, reportedly grew uneasy at how eagerly his young officer was profiting from the bloodshed around him. But property was just the beginning. Crassus had found his method, and now he was ready to perfect it. Rome in this era had no fire department. None. When a building caught fire, it simply burned, and the ones next to it burned with it. Crassus solved this problem. Well, sort of. He assembled a private brigade, 500 men, trained, equipped, and always nearby when smoke appeared over the rooftops. Sir, your building is on fire. My brigade is right here, one of his agents would announce to the panicked owner. Then put it out. The owner would shout back. Well, the agent would say, that depends. Depends on what? The price. You want me to buy my own house from you while it's burning? I want you to sell it to me at a fair market rate, given the circumstances. The circumstances being it's on fire? Precisely. The agent would reply, time is money, and right now your roof is running out of both. If the owner sold, Crassus got the property for a fraction of its value, and only then did his men lift a single bucket. If the owner refused, the crew simply stood there and watched it burn, arms crossed, while the flames finished the negotiation for them. And then Crassus bought the ashes and the scorched lot beneath them for even less than his original offer. Please, I'll sell, just put it out, a desperate owner would cry, watching the flames spread. Too late now, the agent would say, walking away. The price just changed. Sometimes, conveniently, the fire started in the first place near properties Crassus had already tried and failed to buy. Nobody could ever prove it. Nobody needed to. Insurance didn't exist. The city government didn't care. And Crassus just kept expanding his brigade. Within a few years, it wasn't 500 men anymore. Estimates from later historians put it at far higher, an entire private army, technically for firefighting, that operated more like a protection racket with better public relations. Crassus didn't just own real estate now. He owned entire city blocks, brick by brick, disaster by disaster, and half the Roman elite owed their continued shelter to his mercy. But real estate alone doesn't make you the richest man in the Republic. Crassus diversified, and he diversified aggressively. He bought silver mines across Spain, worked by chain laborers in conditions historians still struggle to describe politely. He bought slaves, thousands of them, and instead of simply reselling them, he trained the promising ones himself. turning illiterate captives into architects, accountants, secretaries, and skilled craftsmen, then rented them out or sold them at enormous markups. A slave who cost him a few hundred denarii could be resold, educated for 10 times that. It was, in effect, a factory for human capital, and Crassus ran it like any other asset line. Then came the lending. He financed loans to senators who couldn't say no, at rates that were generous on paper and merciless in practice. Because once a senator owes you money, he owes you his vote. Need a hand covering a gambling debt, senator? Crassus would ask, all warmth. Of course, no interest for the first year. Friends don't charge friends. And after the first year? The senator would ask, already knowing he shouldn't. After the first year, Crassus would say, smiling, we'll discuss it like grown men. Crassus understood something nobody else in Rome fully grasped. Power wasn't just about legions or bloodlines anymore. It was about who held the paper. And Crassus held everyone's paper. A rising young politician needed money for an election he couldn't afford. Crassus was there with a loan and a smile. A general needed funds to outfit his army. Crassus wrote the check before the general finished asking. One young aristocrat in particular, deep in debt, ambitious beyond his means, charming, reckless, and constantly broke, kept coming back for more. His name was Julius Caesar. You're back again. Crassus would sigh. I need 40 talents. Caesar would say, without a trace of embarrassment. For what this time? Games. The people love games, Marcus. And the people who love me become senators who owe me favors, and then owe you favors. It's an investment. Crassus bankrolled his early career almost entirely, funding his campaigns, his lavish gladiator games, his bribes, his debts to half the city. It wasn't charity, it was an investment, and Crassus expected a return someday in full. By his 50s, Crassus was by some ancient estimates worth roughly 200 million sesterces, more than the entire annual treasury of Rome could comfortably cover. He famously said no man could call himself truly rich unless he could afford to raise and maintain a full legion entirely out of his own pocket. He could raise several. He owned houses in nearly every district of Rome, art collections looted or purchased from 3 continents, and a household staff so large he reportedly knew the name and skill of every slave under his roof, less out of kindness and more because inventory management was, to him, simply good business. But money wasn't enough anymore. Crassus wanted something he couldn't simply buy outright: military glory, the one currency that still outranked gold in Roman society. So in 71 BC, he got his chance. Spartacus, the escaped slave and gladiator, had humiliated Rome for 2 years, defeating army after army sent against him, embarrassing consul after consul. The Senate was desperate, and desperate men turned to whoever has the resources to actually finish the job. Crassus raised 6 new legions almost entirely at his own expense. When his own troops broke and fled early in the campaign, he didn't punish them with a speech. He revived the old punishment of decimation, executing 1 man in every 10 from the disgraced units. Chosen by lot, beaten to death by their own comrades. Discipline restored. Crassus told his officers afterward, "You understand why, sir?" One centurion said quietly, "I understand that fear works faster than loyalty." Crassus replied, "Now get back in formation." He chased the rebels down, cornered them, and crushed the rebellion for good. Then, to make absolutely certain everyone remembered whose victory this was, he crucified 6,000 surviving slaves along the Appian Way, 1 cross every few dozen meters, for well over 100 kilometers, so that every traveler entering Rome from the south would walk beneath the rotting bodies for weeks afterward. Message received. Still, the credit for ending the war somehow slipped away from him. Pompey, returning from another campaign, arrived late, mopped up a few fleeing stragglers, and rode into Rome claiming he'd finished off the rebellion himself. The crowds cheered for Pompey. Crassus got a lesser honor, a lesser parade, and a much longer memory. He never forgave him for it, but he needed him because in Rome, resentment and partnership were rarely mutually exclusive. In 60 BC, Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, now returned from Spain and still deep in Crassus's debt, sat down privately and carved up the republic between themselves. Historians later called it the first triumvirate. At the time, it had no name at all, because officially it didn't exist. It wasn't legal. It wasn't voted on. It was 3 men in a room deciding that Rome belonged to them, and that everyone else could vote about whatever scraps of power were left over. "Gentlemen," Caesar reportedly opened, "we all want something the other 2 can provide. Pompey wants land for his veterans. I want a senate that stops blocking my consulship. He turned to Crassus. And you, Marcus? I want what I've always wanted, Crassus said. To stop being the richest man nobody respects. Then, Caesar said, we have a deal. Crassus brought the money. Pompey brought the legions. Caesar brought the ambition, the charm, and not coincidentally, a debt to Crassus large enough to guarantee his loyalty. But the arrangement ate at Crassus more than he expected. He watched his partners win war after war and title after title while he stayed behind in Rome, managing portfolios, collecting rents, quietly funding other men's legends. Pompey had conquered the east and cleared the seas of pirates. Caesar was now carving up Gaul, sending home dispatch after glorious dispatch that turned him into a household name, a living legend, before he'd even finished the campaign. Crassus, the richest man alive by a wide margin, was somehow still the least respected man in the room, the banker everyone used and nobody admired. So, in 53 BC, past 60 years old, with no real military necessity and against the advice of nearly every friend and augur around him, some of whom reported terrible omens before he even left the city, he marched an army east into Parthian territory, chasing one final campaign, one last piece of glory that gold alone had never been able to buy him. The Parthians were not impressed by his balance sheet. Crassus led 7 legions, roughly 40,000 men, deep into unfamiliar desert, guided by a local chieftain whose loyalties, it turned out, belonged entirely to the enemy. At Kerry, in the scorching plains of modern-day Iraq, his legions were surrounded by mounted horse archers, a force built entirely around speed and distance. "Sir, they're not engaging, they're circling," a scout reported to Crassus. "Then hold formation," Crassus ordered. "They'll run out of arrows eventually." They did not. A resupply train of camels kept the volleys endless, wave after wave of arrows raining down from every direction at once, punching through shields, through armor, through men who had nothing to charge and nowhere to hide. There was no line to hold, no enemy to meet in honest combat, just relentless, grinding attrition under an unbearable sun. Roman discipline, the very thing that had built an empire, meant almost nothing against an enemy that simply refused to stand still. Crassus's own son, leading a cavalry charge in a desperate attempt to break the encirclement, was cut off, killed, and beheaded. His head paraded on a spear in front of his father's own lines to break what was left of Roman morale. It worked. Nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers died in the sand that day, with thousands more captured or scattered into the desert, never to return home. Crassus himself, cornered and out of options, was lured into a parley under a supposed truce, one final negotiation, one final deal he believed he could talk his way through. It collapsed into violence within minutes. He was killed on the spot. And then came the final insult, the one that outlived every deed and every denarius he ever earned. According to ancient sources, the Parthian commander, mocking the legendary greed of the man who had just cost him so many arrows, ordered Crassus's severed head brought before him, and had molten gold poured down the dead man's throat. So, the commander is said to have told the corpse, "You wanted gold? Drink your fill then." Whether it happened exactly that way or was embellished by historians who simply couldn't resist the poetry of it, the story stuck immediately and never let go, because it was simply too perfect not to. The richest man Rome had ever produced, finally choking, quite literally, on the very thing he'd spent his entire life chasing. Rome mourned the legions far more than it mourned the man. The disaster of Carrhae became a national trauma, one of the worst military defeats in the Republic's history, and the lost, legendary standards wouldn't be recovered from the Parthians for another 30 years, a humiliation later generations of emperors considered a matter of honor to eventually reverse. Caesar and Pompey, the two men who had used Crassus as much as he had used them, were now freed from their silent, wealthy referee. Without him balancing the triangle, the alliance collapsed within a few short years into open civil war. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Pompey fled and was later murdered in Egypt. The republic that Crassus had helped buy piece by piece, senator by senator, debt by debt, didn't survive the fallout, and eventually gave way to empire under Caesar's adopted heir. His fortune, the largest private fortune Rome had ever seen, scattered quickly among heirs, creditors, and confiscations. The mines, the insulae, the thousands of trained slaves, all of it dispersed within a generation, as if the money itself had only ever existed to hold 3 ambitious men together for a decade. His name, though, refused to disappear nearly as easily. For centuries afterward, Romans used a simple phrase to describe anyone impossibly, almost obscenely wealthy, richer than Crassus, not admired, not exactly, not respected either, just remembered, the way you remember a warning you've stopped taking seriously. He bought grieving families out of their homes while the ash was still warm. He let fires burn for profit and called it business instinct. He crucified thousands of defeated slaves along the busiest road in Italy just to make sure his name traveled with the smell. And somehow, more than 2,000 years later, we still don't quite teach him as a cautionary tale. We teach him, half admiringly, as a benchmark. Every modern rich list, every casual, he's basically the Crassus of his industry comment, tossed around in business schools. Every retelling of the fire brigade scheme dressed up in textbooks as an early lesson in vertical integration or opportunistic acquisition, rather than what it actually was, a man extorting his own neighbors while their houses burned. Maybe that's the real inheritance he left behind. Not the silver mines, not the mansions, not even the gold that supposedly ended up down his own throat. Just the quiet, uncomfortable fact that 2,000 years later, we still measure wealth against a man who built his fortune on other people's disasters. And somehow, we still say it like it's a compliment.